Greetings, everyone, and welcome to God Save the King. I am your host, Tim Kais. Thank you for listening to God Save the King on the Truth Be Told radio network, where you can hear my show every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern Time. I want to thank you for listening today because God Save the King is a show where we rescue truth from familiarity. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, God Save the King is my ongoing 30-plus year biblical, historical, and scientific research project devoted to retelling the nativity the way it really would have happened. And unfortunately, this is because the traditional nativity story is in fact Christian mythology and bears only the vaguest resemblance to what, again, really would have happened. So what we need to do is we need to go in and we need to rescue truth from familiarity, because frankly, we are so familiar with the traditional nativity story that unfortunately a lot of people and a lot of Christians, we don't even question whether it is accurate or not. And the problem is that it's not very accurate. And the real nativity story is not only more accurate and therefore the truth, right? Because this is the Truth Be Told radio network where the truth will be told. Truth is valuable. Truth is really, really valuable. And it is hard for your heart to rejoice in something that your mind considers to be untrue, right? So if you've got cognitive dissonance going on in your head, it is very difficult for your heart to rejoice. And we are to rejoice in truth. And of course, this directly connects to, one of the most famous verses in all the Bible, that you will know the truth and the truth will make you free. So how can you be free if you have no clue what the truth really is? And the truth about the nativity story, wow. Well, that's what we're all about here. So let's dive in and talk about what does the real nativity story really look like. For the past several weeks, we have taken a little bit of a detour, and we've been talking about the fall feasts, the Hebrew feasts, the feasts of the Lord celebrated by the nation of Israel within Judaism. And those fall feasts, it's fall. So it's the time of the year when you celebrate those fall feasts. So we took the time to look at the significance of the fall feasts, primarily the significance of Rosh Hashanah, Yom Teruah, the Feast of Trumpets, which is the day that Jesus would have been born, according to Revelation 12:1, the sign given in Revelation 12:1 and 2 to a certain degree, where it reads that John saw a sign in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon underneath her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. And the woman travailed in pain to be delivered, and she brought forth a man-child that was to rule all nations. Well, that is an astronomical sign. The woman clothed with the sun is the constellation Virgo, with the setting sun in the middle of her body and the setting moon between her feet and the horizon. In other words, under her feet. And then on her head, in other words, above her head, is the constellation Leo, which is the royal constellation. Hence, it is the crown. And Leo normally only has 9 naked eye observable, NEO, only has 9 NEO stars. But on this particular occasion, there were 3 planets in Jupiter, making a total of 12, so hence a crown of 12 stars. A woman clothed with the sun and the moon underneath her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. And this is a sign that will only occur in the heavens about every 2,000 years. It did occur just a few years ago, interestingly enough, but more importantly, it occurred on September 11th of 3 BC. But what's even more important than the date that it occurred on the Gregorian calendar is the date that it occurred on the Hebrew calendar, because the Hebrew calendar is an integral part of the Jewish religion, and it's an integral part of their pattern and prophecy. And I say that way deliberately because to the Jews, prophecy is not just prediction, it is pattern. And the Jewish festivals are clearly a prophetic pattern. The spring and summer feasts of Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits, and Pentecost clearly depict Jesus's first advent, his first coming. He was and is the Lamb of God. He was and is the unleavened bread of life that came down from heaven. He was and is the first fruits from among the dead. And he sent the outpouring of the Holy Spirit on the day of Pentecost. And then when it comes to the fall festivals, right, the Feast of Trumpets is a wake up call, a wake up to repentance. But it was also the day that the Jews crowned their kings and or reckoned their regnal years. And this is due to a Hebrew tradition that God actually created humanity. In other words, the sixth day of creation, the sixth day of the creation account actually occurred on Tishri 1. And therefore, in a manner of speaking, that was the day that God was crowned king of the universe, the king of everything, because according to Hebrew tradition, when Adam woke up, quote unquote, and became aware, the first words out of his mouth were, "And now God is king, the Lord is king forever and ever." And God responded by saying, "Now the whole world will truly know that I am king." So this was a de facto coronation. And so, according to Jewish tradition, this is the day that God is crowned as king. So it is extraordinarily significant that that would be the day that Jesus would be born, because he is God incarnate. He is the Jewish Messiah and the rightful king of Israel. And he was born on Rosh Hashanah, not coincidentally, because coincidence is not a kosher word. So, as Jewish, so this sign that I'm describing, it would have been partially visible in the heavens at about 6:45 to 7:30 p.m. on September 11th of 3 BC. And then the next morning is when you would have been able to see the crown of 12 stars. And it would have required both the evening and the morning observation to put the two signs together in a picture to get the full picture of Revelation 12:1. But that is how ancient astronomy worked. The astronomers would go out and they would do the evening observation in the evening as the sun is setting, and then they would get up in the morning and do the morning observation when the sun was rising, and then potentially put the two pictures together. And remember, of course, that in the Jewish calendar, the new day begins in the evening. It begins at sunset, which is why we read in Genesis chapter 1, and the evening and the morning were the first day. So this is the same thing. And the evening and the morning were the first day. The evening sign was the woman clothed with the sun. The morning sign was the crown of 12 stars. And that would have occurred. So the setting sun, right, would have occurred on the Gregorian calendar in the evening of September 11th, but then the following morning on the Gregorian calendar would have been September 12th. But all of it on the Jewish calendar would have been Aleph B'Tishri, the first day of Tishri. So very, very interesting. And that's how we pinpoint the birth of Jesus Christ. But then also what I did last week is we talked about Yom Kippur, because last week was Yom Kippur. The show happened to fall on the correct date. So we talked extensively about the festival of Yom Kippur, or the solemn fast, rather, of Yom Kippur, and that this is the day that the judgment is sealed, but also the day that God paid the penalty himself. And we talked about the scapegoat mechanism and the fact that all of human religion is really rooted and grounded in communal murder and scapegoating of someone else and trying to get away from responsibility, so that we're not responsible, right? It's that person over there, he's responsible. And so we scapegoat a person, and then we murder them, and then we cathartically relieve the mimetic tension that is going on within us individually and within our communities. But of course, the Old Testament scapegoat practice, right? What's the word I'm looking for here? Prefigured, foreshadowed Jesus, who was the ultimate scapegoat. Not that we blame him for our problems, but that he took our sins upon himself. He became sin for us, that the power of sin might be destroyed. So that is a super quick overview of, why we reviewed the fall feasts at this time of year. But just prior to that on my show, I was delving into what Hebrew wedding practices look like. I had done several shows that I entitled Bought with a Price, part 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., where we were looking into Hebrew wedding practices, Hebrew marriage practices, because this will tell us an awful lot about what the daily life of Joseph and Mary looked like from shortly before they were betrothed, through their betrothal, through Mary's pregnancy, their nuptials, and then the birth of the Messiah. And then about 15 months later, the arrival of the Magi, and then the death of, and the flight into Egypt, and then the death of Herod, and then the return from Egypt, and then going back to Nazareth. So, and these are all parts of the puzzle. Like I said at the very beginning of the show, this project, this 35-year research project of mine, is devoted to telling the nativity story the way it really would have happened, and frankly, getting rid of the traditional versions of the story that really do not help us much. They don't help us a whole lot. We need to get back to the truth of the matter and what it really would have looked like. And what it really would have looked like is based very heavily on the fact that Jesus, Mary, and Joseph were Jewish. Okay, they weren't Christians. Christianity didn't exist yet. They were Jews. And everything they would have said and done would have attested to the fact that they were Jewish. And as I've talked about often in my other shows, the single most important contributing factor to the false nativity story, the traditional nativity story, is an apocryphal work called the Proto-Evangelium of James. Now, the Proto-Evangelium of James, the best we can tell, it was not written earlier than about 150 AD, and it was not written later than about 250 AD, with most scholars landing right in about 200. So this is an apocryphal work that was written about 200 years after the birth of Christ. And it is apocryphal, right? So that means it's attributed to a false author. So it falls in the broad category of what is known as pseudepigrapha, and then the specific category of what is known as apocrypha. Pseudepigrapha simply means it's falsely inscribed. In other words, it is ascribed to an author who we have no reason to believe actually wrote it. And then apocrypha is a distinction within a distinction, that it means the word apocrypha means to be hidden or obscure, but it's in its kind of generic understanding, it has come to mean that it's been excluded from the canon of the scriptures. Well, there's a good reason that the Proto-Evangelium is excluded from the canon of the scriptures, and that is because it's junk. Okay, it is it's fiction. It is absolute fiction. We have a methodology by which we critique apocryphal works. And when we critique the Proto-Evangelium of James, there's really no reason to believe any of it, not even the mundane facts that could prove to be, interesting in a sideways, kind of way. It's one thing to critique it and go, okay, well, the main points are clearly false, but, maybe we can pick up an odd detail here or there that the author didn't realize, he was giving something away. A good parallel example would be if you read, now this is a non-biblical source whatsoever, but because it is from relatively the same time period, I talk an awful lot about the commentaries on the Wars of Gaul written by Julius Caesar. Now, when you critique that, now we know it was written by Caesar. It was legitimately written by Caesar, so it's not similar in the sense that it was written by someone else and then falsely attributed to Julius Caesar. This was written by Julius Caesar, but it's widely recognized. The reason I bring this up is because when we critique it, it is widely recognized to be propaganda. He was writing letters back to Rome from Gaul during his wars in Gaul and writing what he believed the people wanted to hear. So it's widely regarded as propaganda. But then, even once we recognize the fact that it's propaganda, then you can read between the lines, so to speak, and go, "Oh, look, he says this. That's probably spot on accurate. That's probably very, very true because we've learned to identify the things that were written because he was writing what we wanted to hear." Now, if we take that same approach to the Apocrypha and the Pseudepigrapha, what we will discover in most apocryphal and pseudepigraphal works is that most of them, there's not much to go off of. Now, it's a mix of what is legitimate and what is not, and therefore you've got to be able to separate the truth from the error. And then there are some works, of course, where there is pretty good truth, where there's really not a whole lot of reason to doubt the factual accuracy of what's going on. We're just questioning whether it should or should have not been in the canon of the scripture. But then there's works like this one, like the Proto-Evangelium of James, that has so many errors, so many errors that there's really no reason to believe any of it. Okay, not even a very mundane fact. Okay, so like for example, the author of the Proto-Evangelium of James, he discusses in brief, he discusses the geography in and around Jerusalem and Bethlehem, and ironically doesn't really mention Nazareth much, if at all. So that's really provocative because according to the Proto-Evangelium of James, Mary was raised in Jerusalem. She was raised in the temple itself, in Jerusalem, from the age of 3 until the age of like 14. And we're going to talk more about that in a minute because there's a reason for that. There's a very specific reason why that idiom is included in the Proto-Evangelium of James. But according to the Proto-Evangelium of James, Mary was raised in Jerusalem. But when we are introduced to her in Scripture, we are plainly told that she is from Nazareth. Very plainly told that she is from Nazareth. Now, we're not given her background. We're only told that she was from Nazareth. So, on one hand, it certainly isn't impossible that she would be raised in Jerusalem and then moved to Nazareth later. But why? How and why? And even though there are plausible historical reasons why that could happen, once again, we don't really have good indication of that. And frankly, the Proto-Evangelium of James is really sketchy when it comes to the information it gives and why it would be there. Because the first thing you have to do is you've got to compare it to the biblical record itself. And all we are told in the biblical record is a young woman from Nazareth. Okay. Now, there's very good reason historically why you would find a young woman like her in Nazareth. But before we go there, let me do this. I want to share this with you. I'm going to punch up my screen share here, and I want to take a look at something. I want to share a graphic with you that I manufactured, right? And this will help us understand who Mary was. It'll help us understand who Mary was, who Joseph was, and therefore what this really would have looked like, because these were two Jewish young people that would have had a Jewish wedding. So remember, back earlier in the show and for several shows, a while back, this is what I have been focusing on. I have been focusing on Jewish wedding practices. And because Joseph and Mary were Jewish, it is extremely reasonable for us to believe that they would have had a thoroughly Jewish wedding. And we would need extraordinary reason to believe otherwise. Extraordinary reason. right? And the Proto-Evangelium of James describes a wedding format that is foreign to Judaism. They didn't know anything like this, right? Now, what the author of the work did, obviously, it's very, very clear what the author of the work did, is that the author of the work clearly was familiar with Old Testament Judaism and was familiar with the Gospels. Okay, they had it was pretty obvious that whoever wrote this had read Matthew and Luke at least, if not the other Gospels, and potentially, I guess, the epistles, right? Because this is, like I said, this is minimum 150 AD. So the other written works exist at this point. They're there. They're there to be had and there to be read by the right person in the right place at the right time. But they were so the writer of the Proto-Evangelium was, evidently familiar with, at the very least, a couple of the Gospels, potentially all four Gospels, and potentially some of the epistles as well. But then what they were also very evidently familiar with was Romanism, pagan Romanism, pagan Roman practices, pagan practices in general, Roman practices in particular, because what they did is they mixed them together. Because, as I have indicated, the wedding practice that we find in the Proto-Evangelium of James is completely foreign to Judaism. Judaism didn't know anything even remotely like this. Nothing remotely like this. So I want to screen share here, and I want to show you a graphic that I made that really kind of sets things in a unique light when we want to talk about, well, who was Mary, right? So here you go. So here it is. And what this does is this reads, who was Mary of Nazareth? Or in other words, who was the real Mary of Nazareth? Okay. Well, a lot depends. Actually, I've got the wrong. I actually updated this here, and I actually chose the older version. Let's see if I can grab. Can I grab the updated one really quick? Yes. Let me see if I can do this. Hang on, guys. I'm gonna stop the screen share here for a sec. Try to grab this other graphic real quick because this is the correct one. There we go. Much better. Much better, much better, much better. So read along with me here. Who was the real Mary of Nazareth? There are two predominant choices. Number one, a young, devout Jewish woman of royal lineage, born and raised in a small backwater village in northern Israel when the nation was under the heavy hand of a foreign client king appointed by the Roman Empire, the future mother of the Messiah and true-born king of Israel. So that's choice number one. Choice number two is a syncretic Vestal Virgin demigoddess of pseudo-biblical origin common in many so-called Christian denominations around the world. That is how Mary is portrayed, as one or the other. And my intention here is not to offend my Christian brothers and sisters who think otherwise, but it's very clear that this is number one. The real Mary of Nazareth is number one and not number two. And number two is the one that is portrayed beginning with the Proto-Evangelium of James. And then we are off and running and looking at this bizarre person who, is accounted in Christian history from that point forward. So, so what am I talking about here? Well, let's take like at some of the details and let's talk about this. So who was Mary? Who was Mary of Nazareth? Who would she have been biblically? And then who would she have been extra biblically, right? According to the tradition, according to the Proto-Evangelium of James. Well, we know she was a young woman of Nazareth. Okay. Now, do we know for an absolute certainty she was born there? No, we don't. Do we know for an absolute certainty she was born somewhere else? No, we don't. Okay. So no one in this debate can say she was absolutely born XYZ. Okay. We do not know that for sure because when we are introduced to her in the gospel record, we are introduced to her as a young woman of Nazareth. And there, obviously, it's at least possible, if not plausible and probable, that she could have moved there. It's of course it's possible. But the question, as I've talked about many times on my show, the question that we often need to ask is not whether it's possible. Okay. What we need to ask is whether it's reasonable, right? We need to ask, that's the question we need to ask much more often than is it possible, is it reasonable? Is it reasonable to reach this conclusion given the evidence that we have, right? Because what we do know about Mary was that she was Jewish. Okay, we know that. We know that she is of the house and lineage of David. Because if you trace her genealogy, now her genealogy, I always get them flipped in my head, so I got to remember which one is which. Her genealogy is the genealogy in Matthew, and then Joseph's is the genealogy in Luke. All right, and there's a lot of misinformation out there about the genealogies as well. The people that they try to harmonize the two genealogies, they try to make them the same genealogy when all they have to do is realize, no, it's two different genealogies. One is Mary's genealogy, and the other is Joseph's genealogy. And Mary's genealogy does contain a translational error, and that, of course, is part of why it's misunderstood, because it reads that Mary's father's name was Joseph. So the mistranslation is that it reads Joseph, the husband of Mary, when it's supposed to read Joseph, the father of Mary. Okay, so that's Mary's genealogy, and then Joe's genealogy, that's the one in Luke. Okay, so there's a lot of contention about that, but the point being is that when you read the genealogy, it's very clear that Mary is descended from David. Okay, Mary is descended from David. Now, her direct line from David, is affected by the blood curse of Jeconiah, and we won't get into all of that. I refer you to my other episodes that I've done on that subject to understand that one. But see, that we get an end run on that one because of the virgin conception. Okay. And the fact that the biological bloodline doesn't come from the mother, it comes from the father, which, of course, ironically is not Joseph, but is God, right? So therefore, sinless blood and that whole thing. But then also in another episode, we talk about the daughters of Zelophehad, the fact that I believe that Mary did not have any brothers, that she only had sisters. So therefore, and that she was the eldest, and that therefore, when she married Joseph, there was a de facto adoption of Joseph by Mary's father to effectively be his son, because he didn't have any male heirs. And this is provided for in the Torah. And this is not an accident, because this is how the Bible works. This is how the Jewish things of the Bible work. This is really, really, really important, because these things are there for a reason. Everything about the Old Testament, like I mentioned earlier, the Jews don't consider prophecy just prediction. It's not just saying XYZ is going to happen. It's pattern. It's establishing a pattern that they are familiar with. So then when the fulfillment of that pattern hits, you can't help but see it. When I have conversations with people, just in real life, it just coming and going. I was having a conversation with a good friend the other day who, frankly, is not super familiar with my work. And I was sharing some of the highlights of this and pointing out the fact, as we've already talked about, that Jesus was born on Rosh Hashanah. It's the Feast of Trumpets, right? And that this is the day that they recognize their kings. This is the day that they believe that God created humanity and that God was crowned king of the universe. Well, if this is the day that God is crowned king of the universe, and that this is the day that Jesus was born, well, man, is that conspicuous or what? So that's what we're talking about here, is that it's not just a prediction, it's an actual pattern, right? And then with you combine that with the fact that if this is accurate, right, then that means as you could visibly see, as you could visibly see, Revelation 12:1, the woman clothed with the sun and the moon underneath her feet, and Virgo is going down, and the sun is going down, and the moon is going down, right? And darkness is descending upon Judea, right? Mary is in the last minutes of labor and is giving birth to the Messiah. And it says, the shepherds were watching their flocks by night in open field. Well, it's the time of year when that would have happened, and they would have only have been, maybe a mile or two away. It wasn't far, right? Because Bethlehem is actually built on a ridge. And then due east of that ridge is a valley. And down in this valley, and this is part of the reason that we know that the proto-evangelium of James is full of it, is because he doesn't describe the area around Bethlehem correctly, right? Because Bethlehem is built on a ridge. And then if you go down this ridge into this valley, the valley had broad tracts of land. And it was rich farmland where you could easily grow wheat or barley or other things. It was rich farmland. This is where Boaz had his fields. Okay, because to this day, if you go to Israel and you go to that location, they will tell you this is where Boaz had his fields, where Ruth gleaned in the fields of Boaz. But then once you get past this valley that's immediately east of Bethlehem, then you very quickly get into the wilderness of Judea, and you get some olive groves and stuff like that, but then it very quickly starts to become barren. And this is the natural habitat of the shepherds. They wouldn't keep the sheep in the field, okay, in the crop. You wouldn't do that. You'd be destroying somebody's crop. Okay, so you wouldn't be doing that. But what they did do is they did watch them in open country, in the wilderness, which would have been a mile or two away. It wasn't that far. See, so the picture really fits that. Like I said, as the sun is going down, as the woman clothed with the sun is visible on the western horizon from Jerusalem on September 11th of 3 BC, there are shepherds watching their flocks, by night in open field. And it's the time of year when the shepherds totally would have done that. You wouldn't have had to worry about the weather and that kind of stuff. It still would have been very pleasantly warm. See? But Bethlehem is about 5 to 6 miles away from the temple in Jerusalem. So that means 5 to 6 miles north of where Jesus is being born at the same time he is being born, because you've got the woman clothed with the sun. And remember, I said the moon is underneath her feet. Now, if you look this up on an astronomy program, what you're going to see here, let me see if I can punch this up real quick. Let me give a sec. Let me look at this. So let's, won't let me do that? Come on. Okay, apparently it won't let me do that. So don't worry. Okay, so let me just describe it to you. I should have had I didn't know I was going to go there, so I didn't have the visual ready. And that is the woman, when you look at the pictograph, right? The pictogram, the asterism of Virgo at this time of day, she's upside down. Okay, so it is as if my hand here is her head, and then my elbow is her feet. Right? So she's upside down at an angle like this, and her head is actually going below the horizon, and her feet are up above the horizon over here, and the setting sun is in the middle of her body, and the setting moon is over here underneath her feet, right? Well, it's 6:30, 6:45, 7 p.m., and everything is moving down. It's all setting. The sun is setting, and the moon is setting. But what's critical is it's the brand new sliver of a new moon. It's the brand new sliver of a new moon. And that means, and it's not only is it the sliver of a new moon, but it's the sliver of the new moon for the new year. Okay, so that means the month of Elul is ending. Now they knew math, they know how to count, right? But they used this very interesting practice of not only counting mathematically when the new moon would occur, but they visually had to see it. And two witnesses, hence the two witnesses, this is where it says in the Old Covenant, by the mouth of two or three witnesses shall every word be established, right? So you've got the Old Testament mandate, and then we also see an application of that in the book of Revelation, two witnesses. That's because Judaism requires two witnesses. So you've got witnesses outside at dusk and darkness looking for the new moon. And when they see the horns of the new moon, they're going to report this to the Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin is going to make the official declaration that the new year has begun and that it is Rosh Hashanah, it is Yom Teruah, the Day of Trumpets, and that they should blow the trumpets, right? Now, this is significant because on the Day of Trumpets, they blew trumpets all day long, right? So there were trumpets blowing in the temple other days leading up to the Festival of Trumpets, but the official announcement of the beginning of the new year would have been heralded by the blowing of trumpets, right? So once again, put these pieces of the puzzle together. You've got a sign in the heavens, the woman clothed with the sun, the moon underneath her feet, the sun is going down, the moon is going down. You've got the shepherds in the field at the correct time and correct location. It all fits. You don't have to bend and twist it at all. Not at all. It doesn't have to be an exception, right? Shepherds watching their flocks in open field in December is not impossible, but it's an exception. See, so there it is again. The question is not, is it possible? The question is whether it's reasonable. And no, it's not reasonable. Okay. If it's an exception, then show me why it's an exception. And you can't do that because it's not there. There's no reason to make it the exception when it fits the regular understanding. If it fits the regular normal understanding, then that's what's correct. Okay. So once again, women clothed the sun, moon under her feet, setting sun, setting moon, shepherds in the field watching their flock by night, open country. The two witnesses see the new moon. It's the correct day and time for the witnesses to see the new moon. They report to the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin declares it is so, and they blow trumpets announcing the new year. But remember the Jewish tradition that it's in recognition that this is the first day of Tishri, which commemorates the sixth day of creation when humanity is created and Adam acknowledges God as king, and God is de facto crowned king of the universe, and Jesus is born at that time. So if you put all of these pieces together, you have a very stunning picture according to Jewish understanding. Whereas when you try to force the square peg of Christmas into a round hole, it doesn't work that way. Okay? Because you got a problem with the shepherds, right? You've got a problem with the astronomy, because there's no astronomical sign that points to a December 25th birth date. Now, there is a portion of the astronomy that gets you close, but other pieces of the puzzle, the other information leads you in different ways, right? See, because the Magi, now we don't know that the Magi saw the sign I just described. Okay, I believe that sign is there primarily for our benefit, that we as followers of Jesus and partakers of the new covenant, right? And the fact that that's in the book of Revelation, which would have been written in the 90s AD, right? That's there for our benefit. We're told that the Magi, the wise men, we are told that they saw his star in the east, in the rising, in its heliacal rising. And what we have to do there is we've got to dive into what makes Babylonian astronomy significant. And the Babylonians, the Parthians, right, who would have practiced a form of Babylonian astronomy, they were obsessed. Number one, they were obsessed with the planet Jupiter. And if you haven't heard my other segments, his star was the planet Jupiter. There's little to no question about that. Okay. There's little to no question that his star is the planet Jupiter, and they were obsessed with the planet Jupiter. They would have tracked the location and position of Jupiter on a daily basis. See, so the irony is that the Magi arrived in Jerusalem in December. See, there's what throws this off. And that is because we're told that when the shepherds arrived, okay, when it says the shepherds arrived, they met the newborn Messiah. He's lying in a manger, right? And pardon me, a manger is a stone or earthen feeding trough inside the house. It's not in a stable, and it's not made of wood. It's made of either stone or earth. Oftentimes it's dug right into the earth, okay, into the floor of a traditional Judean home. So there wouldn't have been a stable. There was no stable involved at all, right? And he was laid in a manger. He was laid in one of these feeding troughs as a makeshift bed because there was no room in the guest room, right? Okay, not the motel, the guest room. So there was no room in a traditional Judean home in the guest room. Joseph and Mary had to sleep someplace else. So they put the baby Jesus in the feeding trough for the household animals that were likewise kept in the house. But on this occasion, were probably moved out of the house because Mary was busy having a baby, right? So all of these pieces of the puzzle fit together. This way, they fit together to form a picture that makes tremendous sense. You don't have to bend the rules anyway. But the reason I brought up the December thing is because, see, when the shepherds arrived, we are told that they noised it abroad, that they tried to tell people, but then there's no record afterwards that it made an impact, right? The shepherds saw this, and then they told anybody who would listen, but it did not make an impact. But when the Magi show up, and they show up 15 months later, they show up just prior to Herod dying, right? When they show up, there is a tremendous commotion. We are told that Herod and all Jerusalem was troubled at the arrival of the Magi. So one thing that tells us is that it wasn't three wise guys on camels. This was a much bigger, much more significant ambassadorial entourage coming to acknowledge the true-born King of the Jews, which Herod was not. And they marched right into his court and said so. Right? They marched right into his court and said, "Where is he who is born King of the Jews?" In other words, where is the legitimate king? Because you're not him. So Herod and all Jerusalem was greatly troubled. See, so that fits as well. That created a great commotion, right, in and around Jerusalem. And then Herod, it says, of course, murdered all the male children in and around Bethlehem for probably no more than a 1 to 2 mile radius. Okay, not 5, 6, 7 miles, because he missed John the Baptist. If it was 5, 6, 7 mile radius around Bethlehem, he would have killed John the Baptist, and he didn't. Okay, because John the Baptist would have fallen in that time frame, right? They would have got him. Right, but they didn't. Okay, and he was only 5 or 6 miles away, so it was a very small area. The scholars that have really looked into this, instead of falling for the traditional gobbledygook that there were hundreds or thousands of babies killed, which is ridiculous because Bethlehem was a small village, right? So how many male children under 2 years old are there going to be in a village this small, right? That doesn't make sense. That doesn't make sense that there would be hundreds or thousands. He would have had to have wiped out enormous geographic areas of children to do that. No, the correct estimate for the number of male children he murdered, which is still horrific, by the way, don't get me wrong. That's still a tragedy of just amazing tragedy, right? But stretching it would be 20. It's probably 5 to 10, maybe 12, and then stretching it at 20 children, stretching it, right? But once again, now you see that makes sense. But the Magi, when they left Herod's court, and went due south to Bethlehem, it says that the star that they saw in the rising, in the heliacal rising, went before them and stood over where the young child was. See, now this, here you go again, this in the Proto-Evangelium of James, the way you read it in the Proto-Evangelium of James, it literally says that this was a star of like great size, right? As a matter of fact, I've got the text here. Let me see if I can find it real quick. Here it is. Here it is. Yeah. So this is Proto-Evangelium of James, section 21, right? Joseph goes into Judea, and when Herod heard, he was much disturbed and sent officers to the Magi, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the Magi said, "We have seen a star of great size shining among these stars and obscuring their light, so that the stars did not appear. And we thus knew that a king had been born to Israel, and we have come to worship him." Okay, see, so that's junk. I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, that is just junk. It was not a star of great size. It was the planet Jupiter, and the Parthian Magi were obsessed with the planet Jupiter, and they would have tracked it daily as a matter of common practice. See, so every night they would have gone out and said, "Okay, where's Jupiter? He was here last night. He was there the night before. He was there the night before. So that means 1, 2, 3 ought to be right about, oh, there it is, right where we expected to find it, because they tracked Jupiter daily." Well, I put up a graphic on my Facebook page just the other day that I highly recommend you go and see, because it's really cool. It's a really beautiful graphic, for one thing. It's very artistically beautiful, but it's also a great illustration because it's an illustration of what is known as retrograde motion, which is something that Jupiter does every year. And that is because the Earth orbits around the sun at a much faster speed than Jupiter, which orbits around the sun at a much slower speed, right? So because we are on this third rock from the sun moving at this really fast speed compared to Jupiter, that means we could be seeing, now the planets move through the day to day to day to day, the planets move through the night sky from right to left. Okay. So what we would be watching is that we could go out at night and this would happen over the course of several days. What would happen is we, at the right time of year, you go out and you would see Jupiter off over on the right-hand side of the night sky. And then over several days, it starts to move left, moves left. But what's happening is because the Earth is on an interior orbit and moving faster than Jupiter is, even though Jupiter is appearing to move to the left, our rotation, or our orbit rather, which is also right to left, is going to catch up with it and pass it. And as a result of us catching up to and passing Jupiter, Jupiter appears to stop and move backwards. And then later on, it stops again and regains its original course. And this is known as the stations of Jupiter, and it provides a perfect explanation of why the star would go before them and then stand still over Bethlehem, because it had reached one of the stations of Jupiter. And once again, using an astronomy program, we can pinpoint the stations of Jupiter in late December of 2 BC. So the Magi see that, and that's why 200 years after Jesus was born, number one, for the first 200 years after Jesus was born, no one paid any attention to when. No one wrote it down. No one talked about it. The apostles and their disciples and their disciples and their disciples didn't pay any attention whatsoever to what day Jesus was born. It was only 200 years later, when someone finally decided to pay attention to when he was born, that they said, "Oh, well, it must have been in December, because that's when the Magi were there." See, now that makes sense. Now, that doesn't mean that's when Jesus was born. That just means that's when the Magi were there, because when the Magi were there, it created a real mess. See? So it does make sense that they would point to that day and time. That actually makes a lot of sense. See? So once again, getting back to this, all of these things fit together like this without having to bend them and make them fit, right? September 11th, 3 BC is when he's, so the Heliacal rising, by the way, the Heliacal rising of Jupiter that the Magi saw, that was on July 29th of 3 BC. And then what they saw over the next about 15 months was they saw an unprecedented series of astronomical signs involving the king planet Jupiter, which is called Tzedek in Hebrew, and then the king star Regulus, which is called Melech in Hebrew, in the royal constellation of Leo, which is it's the royal constellation which is symbolic of the tribe of Judah. That's why Jesus is called the Lion of the tribe of Judah in the book of Revelation. See, so you've got, once again, you've got all these symbols fitting together. You've got the king planet and the king star in conjunction in the royal constellation of the tribe of Judah. And then it occurred, the Heliacal rising, which is an extremely significant event, pointed to Jupiter and Regulus in conjunction in Leo. Okay. And that would have happened on July 29th of 3 BC. And even though mathematically it is possible for that sign to have occurred before in human history, based upon what we know about astronomical observation, that was probably the first time in human history that that sign was actually observed by human observers. Okay. And that's really significant because then that is what inspired the Magi to travel to Jerusalem and then Bethlehem, saying, "Where is he who is born King of the Jews?" Right. So the same star they saw in the rising, in the Heliacal rising in the east, right? They tracked it for a year. Then they came to Jerusalem. And then in December of 2 BC, oh, what a coincidence. As they're traveling due south from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, the Jupiter goes into the stations of Jupiter and it stands still over Bethlehem, right? But it would have been way up in the sky, and it would have just been it just would have been a standard star, rather bright, but just a standard star shining very brightly, but due straight up and down over Bethlehem. They would have went, wow, there it is, right over top. See? So it was not a star of great size. It didn't act like a spotlight right on where Jesus was. But you can see how all these different pieces of the puzzle fit together now like this, once again, without having to stretch them. You don't have to stretch them to make them fit. You don't have to try to figure out, well, okay, well, he was born on December 25th. Well, no, he wasn't. There's just nothing that suggests that. There's no historical record that suggests that. The earliest historical records, once again, are from 200 years after he was born, and that's way too much time. That's way too much time. That is not eyewitness testimony. Now, interesting thing, because I mentioned this, I'll go there again. The first written record that we have of someone suggesting a December 25 birthday for Jesus of Nazareth. The first written record we have that suggests that was by a man named Hippolytus of Rome. And Hippolytus of Rome, what he was not doing, okay, was he was not examining an unbroken chain of evidence passed down from eyewitnesses. See, now that would be one thing. It would be one thing if he could have said, well, hey, Mary told John, okay, and then John told Polycarp, and then Polycarp told, I think it's Irenaeus, was a student of Polycarp. I don't remember, so don't quote me on that, right? That Mary told John, John told Polycarp, Polycarp told Irenaeus, and then Irenaeus told Hippolytus of Rome. Okay. It would be one thing if you were talking about that, but that's not what this is. I think that's what a lot of people assume is going on, but it's not what's going on. What's going on, oddly enough, is that Hippolytus was endeavoring to do what I just showed you as well, is he was trying to unravel a Jewish hermeneutical principle about the beginning of the world, about the creation. It's just that he didn't do it properly and he picked the wrong date. So it's really interesting that in a way he was not his hypothesis was not necessarily incorrect, but his conclusion was. Right. But like I said, what it's not is it was not an unbroken chain of evidence passed down from one person to another. So, well, ladies and gentlemen, we're getting to that point now where I do have to start to wrap up. I talked about a lot of things today that I actually did not intend to talk on. It just kind of went that way. Hopefully, this was led by the Holy Spirit, and that's why I gave this really interesting overview of how everything came together. All these pieces came together supernaturally, right? It's prophecy is not just prediction, it's pattern. It's not just prediction, it's pattern. And when we see all of these different pieces, when they're assembled, they assemble together in this very unique, interesting picture. See, very unique, interesting picture that we can go, wow, look at that. That must have been when he was born. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me on God Save the King. I want to thank you for listening to my show or watching my show. You can hear my show every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern Time on the Truth Be Told Radio Network. God Save the King.